The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Clarence's house as King Charles stood motionless in his private study, his weathered hands trembling slightly as they gripped a leather-bound folder. Inside were transcripts that would change everything he thought he knew about the woman he had loved for decades, the woman who now wore the crown beside him as queen consort. The call had come at precisely 3:47 a.m. from Sir Clive Alderton, his private secretary, whose usually composed voice carried an undertone of urgency that immediately jolted Charles from his restless sleep. "Your Majesty, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. I'm afraid it concerns Her Majesty the Queen Consort." Now, 6 hours later, Charles found himself staring at words that seemed impossible to reconcile with the Camilla he knew. The phone call in question had been recorded 3 weeks earlier, though it had taken the security services this long to verify its authenticity and trace its origins. What they had discovered was a conversation between Camilla and her longtime friend, Sarah Elliott, a woman Charles had welcomed into their inner circle countless times over the years. The transcript began innocuously enough, with discussions about upcoming state dinners and Camilla's struggles with the more ceremonial aspects of her new role. But, as Charles read further, his heart began to pound with a rhythm that matched the relentless rain outside. Sarah had apparently been pressing Camilla about her true feelings regarding the monarchy, about Charles himself, and about the sacrifices she had made to reach this position. "You must understand, Sarah," Camilla's voice had been captured saying, according to the transcript, "this was never about love, not really. It was about survival, about ensuring my place in history. Charles was always so devoted, so willing to fight for us against all odds. How could I not use that to my advantage?" Charles had to sit down as he read those words, his legs suddenly, feeling unsteady beneath him. The woman he had defended against public criticism for decades, the woman he had chosen over duty and family approval, speaking about their relationship as if it had been nothing more than a carefully orchestrated strategy. But, the conversation had continued, growing more damaging with each exchange. Sarah had apparently expressed concern about how Camilla was handling the pressures of royal life, to which Camilla had responded with what could only be described as shocking candor about her views on the institution Charles held sacred. "The whole thing is rather archaic, isn't it?" her voice had allegedly said. "All this pomp and ceremony, the endless protocols, the way everyone bows and scrapes. I sometimes wonder if we're just elaborate museum pieces, preserved for the entertainment of tourists and the satisfaction of politicians who want to point to our traditions while they dismantle everything else that made this country great." Charles felt as though he were reading about a stranger. The Camilla he knew had shown such respect for royal traditions, had worked so hard to understand her duties and responsibilities. She had stood beside him through the most difficult moments of his reign, offering support and guidance that he had come to depend upon entirely. The security briefing that accompanied the transcript explained that the call had been intercepted during a routine sweep for potential security threats. Modern technology made it increasingly difficult to maintain privacy, even for members of the royal family, and their communications were regularly monitored by various intelligence services, both friendly and hostile. What made this particular interception significant was not just its content, but the fact that it had apparently been deliberately leaked to a journalist known for his anti-monarchist views. The journalist in question, Marcus Wellington, had built his career on exposing what he called the hollow pageantry of inherited privilege. He had been preparing to publish the story when the security services had managed to trace the source of his information back to its origins. The investigation had revealed a complex web of financial transactions and encrypted communications that suggested someone very close to the royal family was actively working to damage the monarchy from within. Charles found himself returning again and again to certain phrases in the transcript, each reading making them feel more real and more devastating. There was Camilla's apparent complaint about playing the devoted wife to a man who still talks to his plants more passionately than he talks to me, and her comment that Charles sees himself as some sort of philosopher king, but, honestly, most of his environmental crusading just makes him sound like an eccentric old man shouting at clouds. The personal attacks hurt, but what truly shattered Charles was the suggestion that Camilla had been systematically undermining his authority behind the scenes. According to the transcript, she had been sharing details of private conversations with various political figures, offering her own assessments of Charles's decisions and policies in ways that portrayed him as out of touch and increasingly irrelevant. He still believes he can change the world through passionate speeches about organic farming and sustainable architecture, Camilla had apparently told Sarah. Meanwhile, the real power brokers are making decisions that will affect millions of people, and they barely pretend to listen to his opinions anymore. Sometimes I think the kindest thing would be for him to abdicate and let William take over while he's still young enough to adapt to the modern world. Charles had dedicated his entire life to preparing for the crown, had spent decades developing relationships with world leaders and experts in fields ranging from environmental science to interfaith dialogue. To discover that his own wife viewed his life's work as little more than the harmless obsessions of an aging idealist was almost too much to bear. The folder contained additional materials that painted an even more troubling picture. Financial records showed significant payments made to various media contacts, suggesting that this was not an isolated incident but part of a sustained campaign. Phone records indicated dozens of calls between Camilla and journalists, politicians, and other influential figures, all occurring at times when Charles believed she was engaged in official royal duties or private relaxation. Most disturbing of all was evidence suggesting that some of these conversations had directly influenced negative media coverage of Charles's initiatives and public appearances. Stories that had seemed like routine criticism from Republican-minded journalists now appeared to have been deliberately shaped by information provided by someone with intimate access to the king's private thoughts and plans. As Charles sat in the gathering darkness of his study, listening to the rain and trying to process what he had learned, he found himself questioning everything about his marriage and his reign. How long had this been going on? How many of their private moments had been nothing more than performance on Camilla's part? How many of his failures as a monarch could be traced back to sabotage from the person he trusted most? The implications extended far beyond his personal pain. If Camilla had indeed been systematically undermining the monarchy while serving as queen consort, the constitutional crisis that would follow any public revelation could threaten the very foundation of the institution he had sworn to protect and preserve. The Republican movement, already gaining strength in several Commonwealth countries, would seize upon such evidence as proof that the entire royal system was corrupt and unsustainable. Charles thought about his sons, about William who would one day inherit this burden, and about Harry who had already chosen to distance himself from royal life. He thought about his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who had spent 70 years building respect and affection for the crown through unwavering duty and personal sacrifice. Everything she had worked to create, everything he had hoped to continue, now seemed to hang in the balance. The rain continued to fall as Charles finally closed the folder and reached for his private phone. There were calls he needed to make, people who needed to be informed about what had been discovered. But, first, he had to decide how to confront Camilla herself. How did one approach a conversation that could destroy not just a marriage, but potentially an entire institution? He looked out at the gardens of Clarence House, where he had spent so many peaceful hours with Camilla, planning their future together as king and queen consort. Those plans now seemed like naive fantasies, built on a foundation of deception that was finally crumbling beneath the weight of recorded truth. The hardest part was acknowledging to himself that perhaps the signs had always been there, carefully hidden beneath Camilla's public devotion and private affection. Perhaps he had chosen not to see them because the alternative was too painful to contemplate. Perhaps, in his desperation to finally have the woman he loved by his side as he took the throne, he had ignored warning signs that would have been obvious to someone less emotionally invested. As the afternoon faded into evening, Charles remained in his study, preparing himself for a confrontation that would determine not just his personal future, but the future of the British monarchy itself. The woman he had waited decades to marry was about to discover that some secrets, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually find their way into the light. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8 times as Camilla returned to Clarence House from what had been described to the press as a private dinner with friends. Charles watched from his study window as her car pulled through the gates, noting how she paused to speak with the security detail longer than usual. Even from a distance, he could see the easy familiarity in her manner, the way she made the guards smile and relax in her presence. It was this natural charm, this ability to make people feel comfortable and valued, that had first drawn him to her all those years ago. Now, as he prepared to confront her with evidence of her betrayal, Charles found himself wondering whether that same charm had been deployed against him as a weapon rather than offered as a gift. How many of their intimate conversations had she filed away as potential ammunition for her campaign against the monarchy? How many times had her apparent interest in his thoughts and feelings been nothing more than intelligence gathering? The sound of her heels on the marble floor grew louder as she approached his study. Charles positioned himself behind his desk, the transcript folder placed prominently in front of him but closed, waiting. When she knocked and entered without waiting for permission, as was her custom, he noticed that her smile seemed forced, her movements slightly too careful. "Darling, you're still working. It's rather late, even for you." Camilla approached the desk with what appeared to be genuine concern, but Charles now found himself analyzing every gesture, every inflection, searching for signs of deception he had previously missed. "We need to talk," Charles said simply, his voice carrying none of its usual warmth. He gestured to the chair across from his desk, a formality they had long since abandoned in their private moments together. Camilla's expression shifted subtly, the practiced social smile giving way to something more guarded. "That sounds ominous. Has something happened? Is it William? Harry?" Her concern for his son seemed genuine, which made what Charles had to tell her even more painful. "It's about a phone conversation you had with Sarah Elliott 3 weeks ago," Charles began, opening the folder and removing the transcript. "A conversation that was recorded and has now come to the attention of our security services." The color drained from Camilla's face so quickly that Charles actually felt a moment of concern for her physical well-being. She gripped the arms of her chair and seemed to stop breathing entirely for several seconds before asking, in a voice barely above a whisper, "What conversation?" Charles began to read selected portions of the transcript aloud, his voice growing steadier as he progressed through the most damaging sections. With each revelation, he watched Camilla's face cycle through shock, denial, and what appeared to be genuine horror at hearing her own words reflected back to her. "Charles, please, you have to understand," she began when he paused, but he held up a hand to silence her. "There's more," he continued, producing the financial records and communication logs. Evidence of payments to journalists, regular contact with media figures known for their anti-monarchist views, and what appears to be a systematic campaign to undermine my authority and effectiveness as king. Camilla sat in stunned silence as Charles laid out the full scope of what had been discovered. When he finished, she remained motionless for several minutes, staring at the papers spread across his desk as if they contained some foreign language she was struggling to decipher. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she finally said, her voice breaking. "Sarah has been my friend for 30 years. Sometimes I say things to her that I don't really mean, things I say when I'm frustrated or overwhelmed. I never imagined that anyone would be listening, that it could be used against us." Charles felt a flicker of his old protective instinct toward her, but forced himself to remain focused on the facts before him. "These aren't just venting sessions with an old friend, Camilla. The evidence shows deliberate contact with hostile journalists, financial transactions that suggest payment for information, and timing that correlates directly with negative coverage of my initiatives. The payments aren't what you think," Camilla said quickly, leaning forward in her chair. "Some of those journalists have been helpful to us over the years, providing positive coverage when we needed it. Sometimes that required financial consideration. I thought I was protecting you, protecting us." Charles studied her face, trying to determine whether this was truth or another layer of deception. The woman before him looked genuinely distressed, but, then, again, she had clearly become accomplished at presenting whatever persona the situation required. "And the comments about abdication? About my work being irrelevant? About our marriage being a strategic decision rather than one based on love?" His voice remained controlled, but Camilla could hear the pain beneath his measured tone. Tears began to form in her eyes, and, for a moment she looked like the vulnerable woman Charles had fallen in love with decades earlier. Those were the words of someone who was scared and, angry and, feeling completely out of her depth. Do you have any idea what it's like to suddenly be thrust into this role at my age? To know that half the country thinks I don't deserve to be here, that I'm some sort of homewrecker who manipulated her way into a crown? Charles felt his resolve wavering slightly. The pressures Camilla described were real, and he had perhaps been too focused on his own adjustment to the crown to fully appreciate how difficult her transition had been. I've spent every day since your coronation terrified that I'll say the wrong thing, do something inappropriate, embarrass you in front of the world, she continued, the tears now flowing freely. When Sarah calls, sometimes she's the only person I can talk to honestly, the only person who knew me before all of this. And, yes, sometimes I say terrible things about the pressures we face, about the impossible expectations, about the way this life can make you feel like you're losing yourself entirely. Charles reached across the desk and offered her his handkerchief, a gesture so automatic and tender that it seemed to surprise them both. But, Camilla, some of what you said goes far beyond venting frustrations. You spoke about our relationship as if it had been calculated from the beginning, as if your feelings for me were part of some long-term strategy. Camilla took the handkerchief and wiped her eyes before looking directly at him for the first time since he had begun reading the transcript. Charles, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I have loved you since we were young, and that love has never been anything but genuine. But I would be lying if I said that practical considerations didn't play a role in some of the decisions we made over the years. She paused, seeming to gather courage for what she needed to say next. When we were younger, when we couldn't be together, I made choices based partly on what I thought would keep me in your orbit. When Diana died and the whole country hated me, I stayed because I loved you, but also because I knew that leaving would destroy both of us politically and personally. When we finally married, yes, I was happy, but I was also relieved to finally have a secure position after decades of uncertainty. Charles listened to this admission with a mixture of appreciation for her honesty and devastation at having his worst fears confirmed. The woman he had fought for, had risked his relationship with his mother and his sons for, was acknowledging that their love story had always been more complex and calculated than he had allowed himself to believe. That doesn't make my love for you any less real, Camilla continued urgently. But it does mean that I've sometimes felt resentful about the price we've both paid for this relationship. And when I'm tired and scared and feeling like an imposter in my own life, sometimes that resentment comes out in ways that are unfair to you and destructive to everything we've built together. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the garden where they had shared so many quiet moments together. The resentment I can understand, even forgive. What I can't understand is how it led to behavior that actively undermines the institution we're supposed to serve together. How many times have you shared information with journalists that was used against me? How many of my initiatives have failed because someone with access to my private thoughts was working to ensure that failure? When he turned back to face her, Camilla was standing as well, her hands clasped together so tightly that her knuckles were white. I never intended to sabotage anything. Most of my conversations with journalists were about positive coverage, about trying to rehabilitate both of our images with the public. Yes, I sometimes shared frustrations about your approach to certain issues, but I thought I was helping by providing insight that might lead to more favorable coverage. Favorable coverage achieved by portraying me as an eccentric idealist whose time has passed. Charles's voice finally showed some of the anger he had been suppressing. I thought if they understood your passion, your genuine desire to make a difference, they might be more sympathetic, Camilla replied desperately. I realize now that I was naive about how my words would be interpreted and used. I trusted people who saw our conversations as opportunities rather than confidential exchanges. Charles returned to his desk and sat down heavily, suddenly, feeling every one of his 74 years. The question now is what we do about this. The security services have managed to prevent the immediate publication of this material, but they can't guarantee it won't surface eventually. If it does, the damage to the monarchy could be catastrophic. Camilla sank back into her chair, the full implications of their situation finally, seeming to hit her. What are you saying? That I should abdicate my position? Leave quietly before this becomes public? Charles looked at her across the desk that now seemed like an insurmountable barrier between them. I don't know what I'm saying. I know that I love you, despite everything we've discussed tonight. I know that I've spent my entire adult life believing that you were my partner in every sense, someone who shared my vision for what the monarchy could be in the modern world. And, I know that everything I thought I knew about us has been called into question by what I learned today. The silence that followed was broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the passage of time that neither of them seemed able to stop or control. Outside, London continued its nighttime rhythm, unaware that the foundations of the monarchy were shifting in the private study of Clarence House. Charles, Camilla said finally, her voice small and uncertain, what happens now? To us, I mean. To our marriage. Charles looked at the woman who had been the center of his emotional life for so many decades, trying to reconcile the person sitting before him with both the woman he had loved and the woman described in the security files. I honestly don't know, he admitted. I need time to think, to understand what this all means. And, you need to be completely honest with me about the full extent of your outside contacts and communications. No more secrets, no more omissions. Camilla nodded slowly, seeming to understand that her marriage and her position hung in the balance of her next choices. There are things I need to tell you, she said quietly. Things that are in those files and things that aren't. If we're going to move forward, you need to know everything. Charles felt his stomach tighten with dread at the implication that there was more to discover. Then, I think you'd better start talking, he said, reaching for a fresh notepad. The night was clearly going to be longer than either of them had anticipated. The clock struck midnight as Camilla began her confession, her voice steady despite the tears that continued to fall intermittently. Charles had dismissed the household staff hours earlier, ensuring that their conversation would remain completely private. The weight of what she was about to reveal seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket, making the air itself feel thick and oppressive. The first time I spoke to a journalist about our private life was 6 months after your mother died, Camilla began, her words measured and careful. It wasn't planned. Marcus Wellington approached me at a charity event, and he seemed so understanding about the pressures we were facing during the transition period. He said he wanted to write something sympathetic, something that showed the human side of the new king. Charles remained silent, but made notes on his pad as she spoke. His training in dealing with sensitive diplomatic situations served him well now, allowing him to listen without interrupting, even as each revelation cut deeper into his understanding of their relationship. I told him about your struggles with the ceremonial aspects of being king, about how much you missed being able to speak freely about the causes you care about. I thought I was helping him understand that you were a thoughtful, caring man who was genuinely committed to serving the country. Instead, he wrote a piece about how you were struggling to adapt to the realities of constitutional monarchy and questioning whether you had the temperament for the role. Charles looked up from his notes, his expression carefully neutral. And you continued to speak with him after that? Camilla's hands twisted in her lap as she nodded. He said the article had been edited against his intentions, that his editors had sensationalized his original piece. He convinced me that if I continued to provide background information, he could write more balanced pieces in the future. I was naive enough to believe him. The admission hung between them for several minutes. Charles found himself remembering the article she referenced, how it had stung at the time because it seemed so informed about his private thoughts and concerns. He had assumed that some courtier had spoken out of turn, never imagining that the source was sitting beside him at the breakfast table. How many journalists? Charles asked quietly. 7, over the past 18 months, Camilla replied immediately, as if she had been preparing for this question. Most of them approached me initially. They all claimed to want to present more nuanced coverage of the monarchy, to move beyond the simple narratives of ceremony and scandal that dominate most royal reporting. Charles felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the scope of what had been happening. Camilla, do you understand that you've essentially been running an unauthorized media operation from within the royal household? That these journalists have been playing you against each other to get information they never should have had access to? I understand that now, she said, her voice barely audible. At the time, I thought I was being strategic. I thought I could manage the narrative, control how we were presented to the public. I'd spent so many years being portrayed as the villain in your story, Charles. When I finally had the chance to try to change that perception, I jumped at it. Charles set down his pen and rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of what promised to be a severe headache. What about the payments? The financial transactions that show up in these security reports? Camilla took a deep breath before answering. That started about a year ago. One of the journalists, Helena Morrison from The Guardian, told me that she was working on a major investigative piece about the monarchy's environmental initiatives. She said it could be either very positive or very negative, depending on whether she could get accurate information about the genuine impact of your programs. Charles knew Helena Morrison's work well. She was a respected environmental journalist who had written several pieces about his initiatives over the years, some favorable and others sharply critical. The idea that Camilla had been her secret source for inside information was almost too much to process. She said that if I could provide documentation about the real costs and benefits of your environmental programs, she could write something that showed their genuine value rather than dismissing them as expensive publicity stunts. So I started gathering financial information from your office, impact reports, correspondence with scientists and policymakers. You were taking documents from my private office? Charles's voice rose slightly for the first time that evening. Copies, Camilla clarified quickly. I never took anything that wasn't replaced immediately. And I genuinely believed I was helping you by providing accurate information that would lead to better coverage of your work. Charles stood and began pacing behind his desk, his composure finally beginning to crack. Camilla, those documents contained sensitive information about government policy discussions, private communications with world leaders, strategic plans that weren't meant to be public for months or years. You weren't just sharing personal insights with friendly journalists. You were conducting unauthorized intelligence operations. Camilla flinched at his harsh tone but continued her confession. Helena said the information was so valuable that her editors were willing to pay for access to it. She presented it as a consulting fee, a way of acknowledging the time and risk I was taking to help her research. The money seemed like, I don't know, validation that what I was doing had real value. How much money? Charles asked, though he suspected he already knew from the financial records he had reviewed. £47,000 over 8 months, Camilla admitted, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. I told myself I was earning it by helping ensure accurate coverage of your work. I never thought of it as selling secrets or betraying confidences. Charles sat back down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was telling him. The woman he had trusted with his most private thoughts, his fears and hopes about his reign, had been systematically monetizing that trust for more than a year. Where is that money now? I donated most of it to environmental charities, Camilla said quickly. I kept detailed records. I can show you exactly where every pound went. I never spent it on myself, Charles. I genuinely thought I was doing something that would benefit your causes. Charles found this detail somehow more disturbing rather than less. It suggested a level of self-deception that was almost pathological, an ability to justify any action by reference to supposedly noble intentions. What about the other journalists? Were they all paying you for information? 3 of them offered payments at various times. I accepted money from 2 others besides Helena. Always with the understanding that it was to support better coverage of the monarchy, never presented as payment for secrets. Camilla's voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if she were trying to convince herself as much as Charles of the righteousness of her actions. Charles pulled out another section of the security report, one he had hoped not to need. What about Robert Henley? The Republican activist who's been advocating for the abolition of the monarchy. Our security services show 17 phone calls between you and him over the past 6 months. Camilla's face went completely white. How do you know about Robert? Because when you're queen consort, people monitor who you're speaking with, especially when those people are actively working to destroy the institution you're supposed to represent, Charles replied, his anger now fully visible. What possible justification could you have for speaking with someone whose stated goal is the end of the British monarchy? Camilla stood and walked to the window, her back to Charles as she gathered courage for what was clearly the most difficult part of her confession. Robert reached out to me through Helena. He said he was writing a book about the future of the monarchy in the 21st century, and he wanted to include perspectives from inside the institution. And you believe that someone who has publicly called for the abolition of the crown was interested in a balanced perspective? Charles's voice carried a note of incredulity that cut through Camilla's composure. I thought I could change his mind, she said, turning back to face him. I thought if he understood the positive work you're doing, the genuine commitment you have to serving the country and the Commonwealth, he might write something more nuanced. Maybe even supportive. Charles stared at his wife in amazement. Camilla, the man has spent his entire career arguing that the monarchy is an anachronistic institution that has no place in modern democracy. What made you think that a few phone conversations with you would completely change his fundamental political beliefs? Because I've seen you change people's minds, Camilla replied, her voice gaining strength. I've watched you win over skeptics through your passion and your knowledge and your genuine care for the issues you champion. I thought if I could convey even a fraction of that to Robert, he might see you differently. Charles found himself momentarily speechless at this mixture of naive faith in his abilities and catastrophic misjudgment of political realities. What did you tell him during these conversations? I talked about your daily routine, about how hard you work, about the briefings you read and the experts you consult before making any decision. I tried to paint a picture of a thoughtful, dedicated public servant rather than the privileged dilettante that Republicans usually describe. And, in the process, you gave him detailed intelligence about the inner workings of the monarchy, about my decision-making processes, about the advice I receive from government officials and international leaders. Charles's voice was now completely flat, drained of all emotion by the sheer scale of the security breach his wife had created. Camilla nodded miserably. I realize now that every detail I shared could be used against us. But, at the time, I genuinely believed I was defending you, defending us. I thought if people understood how seriously you take your responsibilities, they would respect the institution more. Charles looked at the woman who had been his partner through some of the most challenging moments of his life, trying to reconcile her obvious love and loyalty with the catastrophic damage her actions had caused. Camilla, do you understand that what you've described could constitute treason? That's sharing confidential information about the monarch's activities with hostile foreign journalists and domestic Republicans could be prosecuted as a crime against the state. The word treason seemed to hit Camilla like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, her face gray with shock and fear. Charles, I never meant to betray you or the crown. Everything I did because I love you and I wanted to protect you from unfair criticism. But, that's not your job, Charles replied, his voice gentle despite the gravity of what they were discussing. Your job is to support me privately and represent the crown with dignity publicly. You don't have the training or the authority to conduct independent media operations on behalf of the monarchy. Camilla buried her face in her hands, finally, seeming to understand the full implications of her actions. What happens now? Are you going to turn me over to the authorities? Ask me to leave? Charles stood and walked around the desk to where she sat, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder despite everything that had passed between them that night. I don't know what happens now, he admitted. I need to speak with the security services, with my private secretary, possibly with the Prime Minister. The question is whether this can be contained or whether we're looking at a constitutional crisis that could bring down the monarchy. Camilla looked up at him with eyes red from crying. Is there any way to fix this? Any way to undo the damage I've caused? Charles met her gaze steadily. I don't know, he said honestly. But, we're going to find out together. The emergency meeting convened at Buckingham Palace at dawn, less than 6 hours after Charles and Camilla's confrontation had ended. The participants included Sir Clive Alderton, the King's private secretary, Dame Sarah Thompson, head of the Royal Protection Service, Lord Chancellor Morrison, and, surprisingly, Prince William, who had been summoned from Kensington Palace with little explanation beyond urgent constitutional matter requiring immediate attention. Charles sat at the head of the conference table in the palace's most secure meeting room, his face showing every hour of the sleepless night he had endured. Camilla was notably absent, having been asked to remain at Clarence House pending the outcome of this discussion. The weight of what he was about to reveal to his son and closest advisers felt almost unbearable. Gentlemen, Dame Sarah, Charles began, his voice hoarse from exhaustion and emotion, what I'm about to share with you represents the gravest threat to the monarchy in our lifetime. Before I continue, I need your absolute assurance that nothing discussed in this room will be shared with anyone outside this circle without my explicit permission. Prince William leaned forward in his chair, his expression tense with concern. Father, what's happened? Is it Camilla? Is she ill? Charles looked at his eldest son, seeing in his face the same protective instincts that had driven his own disastrous decisions regarding his wife. William, I need you to understand that what you're about to hear may fundamentally change how you view your stepmother and our family's position within the constitutional framework. For the next hour, Charles methodically presented the evidence that had been gathered by the security services, reading portions of transcripts, explaining the financial transactions, and detailing the scope of Camilla's unauthorized communications with journalists and political activists. The room remained completely silent throughout his presentation, the only sounds coming from the scratching of pens as his advisers took notes and the occasional sharp intake of breath as the implications of each revelation became clear. When Charles finished, the silence stretched on for several minutes before Sir Clive cleared his throat and spoke in the measured tones that had served him through decades of constitutional crises. Your Majesty, if even half of what you've described can be independently verified, we are looking at a situation that could potentially trigger the abdication of the Queen Consort and a complete restructuring of the royal household. Prince William had said nothing during his father's presentation, but his face had grown increasingly pale as the scope of Camilla's activities became apparent. Father, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, has Camilla admitted to all of this? Is there any possibility that she's been set up, that someone else has been impersonating her or using her identity to conduct these communications? Charles appreciated his son's instinct to look for alternative explanations, but the evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss. She has admitted to everything I've described and more. The security services have voice authentication on multiple recordings, financial records that trace directly to her personal accounts, and digital forensics that confirm the communications originated from her devices. Dame Sarah Thompson, who had remained silent throughout the meeting while reviewing the security files, finally spoke up. Your Majesty, my primary concern at this moment is operational security. If the Queen Consort has been sharing sensitive information about your schedule, your movements, and your private conversations for 18 months, we have to assume that hostile foreign intelligence services have access to all of that information. The room fell silent again as the implications of this statement sank in. Charles had not fully considered the international security ramifications of Camilla's actions, focusing instead on the domestic political damage they might cause. Lord Chancellor Morrison adjusted his glasses and spoke carefully. From a constitutional perspective, we need to consider several immediate questions. First, whether any laws have been broken that would require criminal prosecution. Second, whether the Queen Consort's position can be maintained given the security risks her actions have created. And, third, whether this situation requires notification of the Prime Minister and potential consultation with Parliament. Charles felt the weight of centuries of constitutional precedent pressing down on him as he considered these questions. What are the legal ramifications? Could Camilla face criminal charges? The Official Secrets Act would certainly apply to some of her communications, Lord Morrison replied. Sharing information about government briefings and international communications could constitute a breach of national security. The payments she received could potentially be prosecuted as corruption, depending on how the Crown Prosecution Service views the circumstances. Prince William finally broke his silence with a question that cut to the heart of Charles's personal dilemma. Father, setting aside the legal and constitutional issues for a moment, what is your assessment of Camilla's motivations? Do you believe she was acting deliberately to damage the monarchy, or was this a catastrophic failure of judgment by someone who thought she was helping? Charles had been wrestling with this exact question all night, trying to reconcile the woman he loved with the evidence of her systematic betrayal of his trust. I believe she genuinely thought she was protecting us, he said slowly. But, the scope and duration of her activities suggest a level of deception that goes far beyond simple misjudgment. She created an entire parallel operation, complete with financial arrangements and strategic communications, all without my knowledge or consent. Sir Clive had been reviewing the timeline of Camilla's activities against major royal events and media coverage over the past 18 months. Your Majesty, I'm seeing correlations between Her Majesty's communications and several significant security breaches that we were never able to explain. The leak of your private comments about the Prime Minister's environmental policy, the premature disclosure of your planned visit to Ukraine, the surprisingly detailed press coverage of your private meeting with the Archbishop of Canterbury about royal succession. Charles felt his stomach drop as he realized that security breaches he had attributed to careless staff or hostile surveillance might actually have originated with his own wife. How much damage are we looking at in terms of our ongoing operations and international relationships? Dame Sarah consulted her notes before responding. It's difficult to quantify without a complete forensic review, but potentially extensive. If foreign intelligence services have been monitoring the Queen Consort's communications, they may have insights into British foreign policy, Commonwealth relations, and internal government discussions that could compromise our position in multiple ongoing negotiations. The meeting continued for another 2 hours as the group worked through the practical implications of the crisis. Immediate steps were taken to change all security protocols that Camilla might have had access to review and potentially postpone several upcoming royal engagements, and to begin the delicate process of assessing which foreign partners might need to be quietly informed about potential security compromises. As the formal meeting concluded, Prince William remained behind to speak privately with his father. Charles dismissed the advisors and sat back in his chair, feeling every one of his 74 years weighing on his shoulders. Father, I have to ask, William said when they were alone. What are you going to do about Camilla? About your marriage? Charles looked at his son, seeing in his face the same concern for the institution of the monarchy that had driven the royal family through centuries of personal and political crises. I honestly don't know, William. 24 hours ago, I would have said that Camilla was the most important person in my life, my partner in everything I hoped to accomplish as king. Now I'm not sure I ever really knew her at all. William moved to the chair next to his father, abandoning the formal seating arrangement they had maintained during the official meeting. Do you still love her? The question hung in the air between them, encompassing not just Charles's personal feelings but the entire future of the royal family. I love the woman I thought she was, Charles replied finally. Whether that woman ever existed, or whether she was just a performance designed to achieve a specific goal, I'm no longer sure. The monarchy has survived worse than this, William said quietly. The abdication crisis, the divorce scandals of the 90s, Harry's departure. We adapt, we endure, and we continue to serve. Charles nodded, drawing strength from his son's calm assessment of their situation. The question is whether we can contain this situation or whether it will explode into a public scandal that destroys everything your grandmother spent 70 years building. We'll find a way, William said with the confidence of someone who had spent his entire life preparing to carry the weight of the crown. But, Father, you need to decide what you're willing to sacrifice to protect the institution. Including your personal happiness, if necessary. Charles understood the implication behind his son's words. The monarchy was bigger than any individual, including the king himself. If preserving the institution required the sacrifice of his marriage, his advisors would expect him to make that choice without hesitation. As William left to return to his own duties, Charles remained alone in the conference room, surrounded by the evidence of his wife's betrayal and the weight of decisions that would affect not just his own life, but the future of the British monarchy itself. Outside the palace windows, London was waking up to another day, unaware that the foundations of one of the world's oldest constitutional monarchies were cracking under the pressure of secrets that could no longer be contained. The secure phone on the conference table rang, interrupting his solitary contemplation. Sir Clive's voice came through clearly. "Your Majesty, I'm afraid we have another development. The journalist Marcus Wellington has just published a story claiming he has explosive revelations about the royal family that will be released within 48 hours unless his demands for exclusive access are met." Charles closed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The crisis was about to become public, whether he was ready or not. The time for private confrontations and secret meetings was ending. Soon, the entire world would be watching to see how the British monarchy handled the greatest threat to its survival in generations. "Thank you, Sir Clive," Charles said quietly. "Please schedule another emergency meeting for this afternoon. It appears we're running out of time to manage this situation quietly." As he hung up the phone, Charles realized that the next 48 hours would determine not just the fate of his marriage, but the survival of the institution he had sworn his life to protect. The woman he had loved for decades had set in motion a chain of events that could destroy everything, and now it was up to him to decide whether the monarchy was worth saving at any cost, including the sacrifice of his own personal happiness.